Hey, well, welcome everyone. This is a post-election, way overdue rebroadcasting of what the is going on in our lives. So I'm joined today by my friend James Desborough. We felt it was necessary to take some time to just have a conversation about where we are post American elections. And, as my background as a chef and a crisis manager is, I always try to boil down to the why. So when I come to a new account that is blowing up, the first thing is that I'm walking in and I have fresh eyes. I have new eyes. So I'm able to see, I know what the system's supposed to be like for the company I work for, and I can walk into a kitchen and see where the system is broken down. Um, what I think the major issue, and this is the same issue I will walk into for any kitchen, is lack of training, lack of education, lack of understanding in the United States of civics. When I was just a wee boy, until I was a wee man. All through high school, at various points, you would learn about what it meant to be a resident of the state of Michigan, and we would cover the state constitution and the history of the state. And as you would go through coursework over the years, you would just progress and progress until by the time you graduated, the last course we took as seniors was US government. And we went through the Constitution amendment, by amendment. We went through, uh, how the balance of power is supposed to work, why we have it. And, this was back. So I graduated high school in 1985. And one of the things I noticed pretty soon after I left and joined the Navy to see the world was that very conservative forces who were aligned with national organizations like the Moral Majority began to take over school boards, county committees. So when I came back from the Navy in 6 years, my state had transformed and continue to transform to, the state of Michigan was considered part of the blue wall. Guaranteed, this is solid, hardcore, working class, blue collar, pro labor, unionized voters. And that's the other thing that went away through coming out of the 80s, the busting of the unions. So, you know, I relate a lot of things back, not just to the culinary world, but to gaming. And so my reintroduction into gaming, I began to see how a lot of the core concerns I have about American culture, cancel culture, the use of social media as a weapon to make a concerted effort to destroy other people's lives because they hurt your feelings or they believe something different than you. So here we are. I am obviously disappointed. I'm unsurprised. I spent the summer in the Midwest talking and meeting with people, and they're all pretty pissed off. Your former blue wall feel completely abandoned by a group of highly educated, overly educated in some cases, with very little real world experience. We have an elite group of politicians who are telling us how to think, how to live. And that's, to me, seems to be the issue. right? So I've asked Jim to come because we have real similar views on political philosophy, epistemology, and in particular, I think we've both been really focused on the importance of community and building bonds of friendship and trust that come around the gamer table. So I asked him to join me because he's a Brit. He's looking at us from the outside. I've been looking at his country from the outside, and we both have insights. And so, what I learned a long time ago is um, to keep my paradigms porous. In other words, have an open mind and be interested in what people have to say that I may find offensive. And I deal with this now on a regular basis because people who find me offensive decide that I'm mean. And what I've discovered is no, what I've said is something that's just a criticism of what you believe, not a criticism of you. And I think that's part of where we also fall apart as a human animal. So,
Mm.
Jim, tell me what you saw over the last week.
Well, I'll tell you how I think I'm qualified to comment first, as you did. I studied politics and history at college formally, so I have formal education in these spheres. Of course, studying British politics is a lot more convoluted than American politics because we don't have a written constitution and we have a lot of history. So it's even more difficult to get a handle on British politics. My wife is American, so I am tied to what goes on in the States. As a result of all this, she's going to be pursuing her British citizenship now. So that kind of gives you an indication. I work with a lot of Americans, and I particularly work with a lot of marginalized Americans from various communities and people who work in the adult entertainment industry, things like that. A lot of people who are under threat from a renewed Trump administration. I think distance often gives people clarity on things that are going on in other countries. We're not uninformed about what goes on in the States because the US is such an important global power. Um, I do find a lot of people say, "Oh, what do you know about it? You're foreign." Well, I have an interest in history and politics, and I have all these links to the States, so I follow what has been going on.
And
Um,
it's not like there's a language barrier, right?
Divided by a common language, as has been said.
You know, but real quick, so I just want to ask, so what is being British really a better proposition for your wife? I mean, because that's what I've been looking at, what's going on in Britain. So,
Well, there have been various problems in the past. Like the states decided that all Americans everywhere had to pay tax on their earnings to the American state, which seems a profoundly un-American thing to me. But what do I know? And it's safer, I think, wanting to safeguard and have that extra level of distance and protection from what's been going on there. Plus, if she gets her citizenship, then relatives of hers in the States will find it easier if they want to come over here. Things like that. It just eases the whole process if you have family who are citizens.
oh
Same as you
no,
can.
not chain migration. You don't, that to happen. Oh,
Yeah. Yeah. But what have I seen? I mean, this shouldn't have even been close, and yet Trump has had a rather decisive win. And it makes no sense to the rest of the world. And all of the pollsters and the internal polling in the parties and everything doesn't seem to have picked up on it. And I think that's something we have to get a grapple on. How much of this is internet brainworms? How much of this is people being ashamed that they're going to vote for Trump, but doing it anyway, so they don't tell the pollsters, and then they make up their mind at the bottom. You were talking about education. I think that's part of it, but it's hard to make that point without sounding like you're calling people ignorant. And even if they are ignorant, that sounds like an insult, when it isn't necessarily. That someone doesn't have the necessary facts to make a properly rational judgment. That's not necessarily insulting. It's willful ignorance that's bad and is genuinely insulting. I also think America is very parochial. Hardly any Americans have passports. Hardly any of them have even been out of their own state, let alone to another country, usually, unless they live on the border. So I don't think they understand how America fits in on a global basis. So I see people, a lot of people are saying, well, it's the economy, yeah, and citing inflation. But you look at inflation, it's been in the States, it's been going down for 6 months. It's a lot worse in other places outside the States. You look at fuel prices. America pays very little for its fuel, though you might feel stung every time it goes up. But compared to everywhere else, it's not much at all. And my therapist tells me I do too much second and third order thinking. So I don't just look at what's happening. I look at the repercussions of what's happening, and then the repercussions of the repercussions. So I get kind of ahead of myself, which has its own drawbacks. But I think a lot of people are stuck on that first thing. Eggs are too expensive. I'm going to vote for the guy that's supposedly good on the economy. Okay, but what about trans rights? What about women's reproductive rights? What about the right to free expression for adult performers and entertainers? What about all of these other things? What about the situation in Ukraine? What about Taiwan? What about Iran? What about Israel? And no, I just want my eggs to be cheaper again, and hang the rest of it, or they didn't even think of it. So
Well, it's an interesting point because what I want to address very quickly there, because you've brought out a key issue about Americans that has been a point of contention for me for decades. Okay, so I grew up on a small farm. We raised almost, there were years where we raised almost everything we ate. There were, all we bought were staples. That's how I learned what staples were as a kid. That there were things that, salt, sugar, flour, you um, toilet paper. um, and then, so this is by 1985. I'm graduated high school 87. I'm off the farm, and I discovered, like you said, we're a parochial people. I was more well traveled than most of my peers who, most of them went to Florida, and they all went to really the same region of Florida on the Gulf Coast, because that's where people from Michigan would buy their little summer or winter Florida homes. I traveled, much further south in Florida, where I spent a lot of time where everybody spoke Spanish. Everybody, half the population speaks Spanish. And I spent a lot of time moving up into Canada, and into very, very remote parts where, people either only spoke French or they had a really, really thick accent. My grandparents are New York City Jews. So I just had a more cosmopolitan experience. My grandpa was a traveling salesman. We would eat out because he ate out on expense as a salesman. So he, and New Yorkers, and he was what they would today call the foodie. Before they used to call it a gourmand. And when I joined the Navy, I discovered, man, I was way different than I realized. How generic the vast majority of Americans' experiences growing up. What's happened is that Americans have been convinced that they are the pinnacle of civilization, of culture. And what they don't understand is that democracy is a game. It's not just a game because it's a game because it's a verb, right? It requires active participation. And politics is the game of democracy being played. And the problem is we haven't learned the rules. So either you learn the rules of the game or you get played by the rules lawyers who cheat. And that, I believe, is part of the fundamental issue. I grew up in a place and a time where one of the most respected men in the community was an old farmer, Boob Schultz. All right. He was a pillar of the community. Why? Because you knew that you could go to him for help. You knew you could go to him for advice. You knew that if you went and said, "Hey, man," because this is what happened. Me and my boy will come and help you bale hay if you come and bale our field. And that person is now looked down upon by the Democratic elites. They no longer see the value of being Boob Schultz.
Mm.
So when I think about why did this happen, it happened rules, not understanding the rules, not understanding the game, and this lack of the old term, don't hate the player, hate the game. And people are hating the
Mm.
players.
It's still mystifying to me, though, that they would go Republican, because the Republicans are not on the little guy's side. They're not on the working classes side. They're not on the farmers' side. A vote for them is going to materially make all those people's lives worse. It's just they say the right thing. They lie,
The
like you said.
immediate fuck you to the elites. That's remember you talked about the various orders
Mm,
of thinking. This is first order thinking. I'm
yeah.
pissed at you, fuck you, and then I'll deal with the repercussions and the fallout. Because that's what
Mm,
their lives have always been like. There is no structure and order and sense of security among the middle class anymore. I grew up at a time where if you were middle class, then you were set. Your life was comfortable. You went on vacation every year with the kids. You had one and a half cars. Blue, 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 all the things. Like I said, I didn't have that growing up. Like I didn't. We were
yeah.
as lower middle class as you could be without being technically poor, right?
Mm,
So, um, I didn't realize that because to me, being poor meant no clothes, no house, no food.
mm,
So I got new clothes 3 times a year before September when school start, August when school starts, Christmas time, holidays, Hanukkah, and then my birthday happened to be in May. So boom, 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 3 times throughout the year, new clothes. So I always had clothes.
yeah.
And we raised a lot of our own food. We had chest freezers filled with food. Even even when things got low, there was still always matzahs and eggs. And
Yeah.
then we had a house. Didn't strike me as odd that it was an 80, 100-year-old farmhouse with no insulation, and we heated with wood burning stove and went through a 3-year period where we didn't have a hot water heater and blah 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 blah. But
Yeah.
in my mind, we weren't poor. I always had a new book when I wanted one. Once I started playing D&D in 79, I was able to, get earn an allowance. I had real chores. I had real responsibilities. My brother and I were required to get ourselves up, fed, and out of the house to go to school, do the chores before we left, do the chores when we came home. So what does all this mean? That what all this means is that the vast majority of Americans are completely disconnected from their food. They have
Mm.
no idea how to raise an animal. So I got into this kick, at this time as I was getting out of high school and meeting all these people. I felt part of your public education should be breeding, raising, and slaughtering some animal. And then you can
Yeah.
choose whether or not you want to participate in the omnivore part. Can you do this? Can you be part? Is this within your constitution? uh, because people are so separated. They just
Yeah.
don't understand where their food comes from. And so this get
Yeah.
back to my original issue that Americans insist on paying less than 10% of their income on food. That's why we have
Mm.
cheap, shitty garbage filled with chemicals, preservatives, high fructose corn syrup, and more salt than anybody needs to eat in a day.
Yeah. That's again, the travel thing comes in there because Americans who travel to Europe um, often find that their dietary issues go away. They shed weight even though they're eating more. They're walking more because we have decent public transportation and all this. But most Americans will never experience that. They will never see the outside. I'm in a weird position, right? I live in the countryside. I live the career of, a middle class pseudo intellectual information worker, right? But I have plucked and gutted birds for dinner. I live next to farms. I grew up alongside farmers and workers. I'm in this weird position that a lot of people in my situation aren't. But I can't help but keep coming back to the fact that the people they voted for are not going to help them. You're talking about having a house. I mean, even having a ramshackle house is a huge thing these days. The couple of generations below ours. I mean, we only have a house because we luckily inherited it. But the generations after us got virtually no chance of ever owning property, and a president from the rentier class is not about to change that or make any differences. Yeah, none of what's going on is going to help them. I mean, this whole idea of the elites, by the real meaning of elite, you would want elites running things because elites are the best educated, the most capable, the most intelligent in the real meaning of the word. Those are the people you would want to be in charge of things, and yet it has become this curse word, and
It's
it's not
because
like
the elites have self-selected themselves. They are not Boob Schultz.
yeah.
That's why. That's why they reject them.
But you're not going to tell you can't sit there and tell me that Trump isn't the elite, wealthy con artist that he is. That's part of the
I
elite.
hated the
Elon
guy when
Musk.
his book came out. I could not stand Trump. I used to work in a bookstore when his book came out, and then I saw him on Oprah, and they showed his apartment, and I was like, well, this is not American. This guy wants to be royalty. This guy thinks
Yeah.
he's Spanish royalty or Louis the 14th or whatever. This is
Louis the 16th, I
horrible.
think. Yeah,
Well,
he's
whoever
got this
had all
whole
the gold and the Versailles, who built Versailles, all that stuff.
yeah.
Anyway, it's so ostentatious. It is so not middle class. What it is soap opera.
Yeah.
It's soap opera elite. It's soap opera fancy.
Yeah, Dynasty for people old enough to remember it.
There you go. Yeah.
Yeah,
Dallas.
yeah, yeah. So they actually got their hands dirty on Dallas occasionally, even if it was just around the ranch.
Yeah.
uh
So
yeah.
so what do you I mean so obviously this is a conundrum outside of the US because um I'm in a fairly unique position. Like I said, I grew up as part of the working class. I come from a blue collar, pro labor, pro union household. Um, and I also bought into the, hey, you should go to college. That's how you get
Mm.
ahead. You're smart. That's the best way for you. And I think this is also another bone of contention. There is a serious lack of respect among, we'll just continue to use this phrase, the political and economic elite to denigrate and really discourage their children from pursuing the trades, no matter how much they enjoy putting a car back together or working in a wood shop building furniture. Because, you know, who wants to admit that their kid is a carpenter when they're at the country club?
Yeah, that's changed a bit over here. And I don't know exactly why, but the trades have gone up quite a lot in people's esteem more recently, and there's less of a social barrier to people taking on apprenticeships and things like that. I don't really know why. I think it's the possibly the escalating cost of higher education is a big part of it, and we do have a sudden shortage of people who can actually do things since Brexit. So,
It's
carpenters,
student loan.
roofers.
Do you
Yeah,
guys
we
use?
didn't use we didn't used to. This happened during my
Mm,
lifetime. We used to have grants, which would be paid, and then you would take a job on top to top it up and give yourself the extra money. But the grants would generally cover your tuition and maybe some of your housing costs. But we switched over to loans, which was a terrible idea and should never have been done. But the idea was this was under the previous Labour government. The idea was that you would open up higher education to many, many, many more people, which was the case for a while. But then tuition fees and everything started climbing higher and higher because the institutions were being run like businesses, not like educational establishments. And then employers just started ramping up the requirements that they were expecting from people. So they just, a lot of very basic entry level jobs require you to have a degree, but it doesn't matter what you have a degree in. They just want you to have a degree. Um, yeah. So it became kind of self defeating.
yeah, I came to understand that a bachelor's in the United States was just a stick to it degree. You just proved
Mm,
you could stick to it for 4 years to get to this point. So it showed you had some ability to focus on a task and be a good, employee, wage slave, salary slave, whatever.
yeah.
Yeah, we're struggling here in the US. The understanding that we have a gap in both the skills and the personnel for the trades. But what people fail to understand is that among my peers who went into the trades right out of high school, they started retiring 2 years ago. These guys, the ones that were really disciplined and economically, fiscally responsible and just set themselves up. Yeah, those guys, they're 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 doing their second careers or just hanging out or whatever. They're done
Yeah.
with the daily grind. And that was because of a trade and a union.
Yeah.
And
And
now we hear how horrible those things are. So do you have a strong union for the trades in Britain?
we do have strong unions to a point. Thatcher kind of demolished a lot of their power when she
Mm-hmm.
broke the coal miners union in the 80s and a bunch of the other unions. But the communications workers union is still pretty strong over here, and the railway unions are still pretty strong. The teachers unions pretty strong. I mean, they're hemmed in a lot, but they find ways around it. Um, But every time there's a conservative government, they lose more ability to collectively bargain,
Right.
which is why I think we see, relative pay continue to go down. Um, and what the right has successfully done over here is to instill in people jealousy of
Mm,
the careers that do have strong unions and thus get paid more. It's like, oh, why should they get more? Well,
right.
because they organized and collectively bargained for it. Join a union yourself if you want the same. But that's not how people treat it. They tend to blame the union.
Yep.
Um,
Well, I mean, we have lots of issues with unions in general because, the adage that power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely. And so, um, we work well, here in the United States, 100%. We work in a culture of incompetence and unprofessionalism and trying to figure out how much you can get away with and still keep your job. How little work can you do and still receive that check every 2 weeks? So, unions have gotten a bad rap. Of course, there's a real strong connection to organized crime with unions in the United States. We still don't know where Jimmy Hoffa was buried, things like that. But for me, like my parents were, young union members. I remember going to organizational meetings, going to the union hall where everybody's yelling and screaming and voting and all the kids. And that's what they would do is at the unions. And then they would have an area to, keep the kids, give them activities, do a potluck.
mm,
I mean, that's where this is, you want to talk about exposure. And so when I was in wow, let me think. Bah, 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 bah. So when I was in second grade, so I had all these friends that I had through the union, and then I had all my friends at school. And for my birthday, we invited kids from school and the kids from the unions. Well, all my friends from school were white, and all my friends from the union were black. And yeah, turns out even in second grade, going back to school, that was like blah, 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 blah. There was all kinds of, you know, whisper, rumor, what at second grade. And I
yeah,
lived downriver Detroit, man. Um, which brings me back to another thing about this issue with Americans, right? So the other thing I've discovered is part of what we're experiencing is the competition among the princesses to see who is uncomfortable with the smallest p and can whine and cry the most about it.
mm,
So people will go, oh, like you mentioned the farm, the smells. What? Look, man, when I lived in Detroit, I lived in Wyandotte, okay, which is downriver Detroit, and when I looked out my window, my bedroom window at night, I could see the flame burning over Wyandotte Chemicals that was burning off gas stuff,
yeah,
and the smell was constant and persistent. And when the decision was we're going to move out to the country, and the first time we went out to the country and I smelled fresh manure, I was like, I don't care. This is infinitely better than Wyandotte Chemicals off gassing. And then I
mm,
was in third grade. This is in third grade. I was like, oh, absolutely. I don't care how much people complain about it. The smell I mean, look, there's the putrid rotting corpse of a dead animal, that's a little overwhelming. But even that will go away, and it's not
yeah,
going to cause you cancer.
yeah, which is something. So Biden's actually been pretty good for the unions, and he was handed a pretty shit state of affairs from Trump before.
Mm-hmm.
We talked about inflation, how that's been going down for 6 months, and then Harris for her VP pick chose Waltz. It's very much a blue
Mm-hmm.
collar, American. He seemed able to communicate incredibly well with ordinary people. So why didn't that land?
That's part of the deeper question, because though I was leaning towards Shapiro, and that shows my bias because the most important thing I knew about him was his last name was Shapiro, so he was a Jew. Um, but once I heard Waltz, I was like, oh my God, yeah, this is actually as good as you could get. I could not actually imagine a better foil for
Yeah.
everything that was in the Trump, the entire MAGA movement. He is the exact opposite of everything they proclaim. I mean, this is a guy who, so oh man. So first off, he reached the highest enlisted position possible. This is a major accomplishment for anybody, no matter who you are. Um, he became a teacher, a football coach. He was known for, creating a strong sportsmanship program. And I think that's actually also an underlying issue in America is we don't teach sportsmanship anymore. We don't believe in sportsmanship. We just believe in
Mm.
our own team winning now. I've always, I look, man, when I played football in high school, we never won a game. So I had to learn good sportsmanship because we always sucked.
Yeah.
Um, but Waltz is veteran, high school teacher, and then high school football coach. And, he saw the need for creating a, and it's terrible that they've destroyed and pilloried this name, but he created a safe space for kids to go to school.
Mm.
What's wrong with that? What's wrong with wanting to know that when your children are in the building that your taxpayers pay, your tax dollars paid for, that no matter who they are, what they believe, how they dress, how they act, they're safe? This is one of the things. These are like these weird, I yeah. So, there's a mythology in the United States about picking yourself up by your own bootstraps. There's the mythology of, well, again, Boob Schultz, the strong, you know, silent man who just makes things happen. And I don't think men have that opportunity anymore. This is, going way, way back to some of the things I'm really concerned about in gaming and things I want to address is, again, 14 to 26-year-old boys are lost.
Yeah. I want to linger on that for a second. Um, so something I've seen repeatedly in my timeline is that, well, from one side of saying, well, you ignored men's issues, you ignored men's work problems, um, you've feminized society, or whatever. You have that coming from one side, and then from the other side, they are just blaming men as a whole for Trump winning. Even though it's only barely over half that voted for him, still way too many, but still, you can't blame the entire gender for it. And that attitude does, to me, seem to be part of why he won. This attitude that men are horrible, all responsible for everything bad that has ever happened or ever will happen. I don't find that as convincing as an excuse as I did the first time around, because we know how awful Trump is this time around. So people who still voted for him, I have a lot less sympathy. But I think at an intellectual level, we can understand that if you just ceaselessly berate and beat people down and call them the villains and insult them, they're going to snap back in some way, and this is a way they found to snap back. Um,
Correct.
I don't know where you sit with that.
Well, so decades ago, my ex-wife at the time was my wife at the time. My ex-wife was studying to get her master's in human geography. She came across a book called um shit. It's by Freire. It's about education systems. So um in essence, what his theory is what is another term for teaching theory, teaching structure? My aphasia's kicking in right now. Not a, anyway, I'll figure it out later.
Yeah.
So he came up with this idea that, when oppressed people rise to power, they're going to oppress their oppressors.
Yeah.
That what is is needed, and this is a foundation of what I call my encounter politics. Encounter politics, I need to first be able to meet with you in person. I need to create a place that is hospitable, and what Freire calls is a third space.
Mm.
I work hospitality politics, is what I refer to it. And then material politics. I need to know what material thing in your life do you need to make your life better so that you can reduce your overall level of stress so that you can take care of the things that you need to take care of instead of worrying about the things that you can't take care of because it's a structural systemic problem, and that's what government is for. So one, that's not what the Democrats practice at all.
Mm.
They practice very much at a theoretical, um, I'm going to tell you pedagogy of the oppressed.
Mm.
So I'm going to tell you how things are supposed to be, and that that structure of the way things are supposed to be um, isn't fair. It's just not. And so I think that on the furthest, because you don't even have to be right leaning to be a man who feels they've been pushed out. So
Mm.
I've seen a couple different, when I say young men, like in their 30s, um, who were doing various things on YouTube that were very intellectually interesting and stimulating, and then they were attacked by the woke crowd, by being told, one guy in particular, this guy Andrew Gold, I like some of the stuff he does. He's British. And he talks about, this issue of how men are being removed. So he was a documentarian, and he went and he was very clear. He went to multiple places. What did he want to do? He wants to be a documentarian. Oh, that's great. Well, you can't be the face. We will have to
Mm.
have someone else be the person who is the presenter. Why? Because he was a white man.
Yeah.
Now, what I'll say is actually he wasn't, because he was Jewish.
Mm.
Jews aren't white people. I'm sorry to tell the rest of the world who thinks it's convenient to force all kinds of ideas, stereotypes, and preconceived notions on Jews. But if we were white people, we would be in charge. We're not in charge. If we were in charge, the world wouldn't be this way. I mean, it's like, this is because I too am a second, third, fourth order thinking. I mean, I'm looking at all these things because I'm a big picture thinker who's able to come down to very, very minute details. And I'm always trying to understand why. And
Yeah.
so anti-intellectualism in America,
Yeah.
seriously, has
That's a
always
big thing. Uh, so this anti-intellectualism amongst the working class is it's not new, but it's not old, I guess. Yes, since the 80s, really. It's
Tocqueville wrote about it.
mm. But it used to be that being educated was seen as a good thing amongst the working class. You know,
Mhm.
it let you interact with the middle and upper class on their own terms. It gave you an understanding of the theory and systems that were at play. Unions used to invest money in educating their members and their members' kids. You know, stuff used to be published, directed at that. There used to be all kinds of small press and so on doing all this stuff. That's all gone. Um, and I think the working class is seen as masculine, and masculine is seen as being bad, like you say. And yeah, it is really difficult to talk about these things. And what calls itself the left has largely abdicated that field to the right. So, we have undeniable issues about men's mental health, men's homelessness, men's education, all of these issues. Nobody wants to address them because the moment you even try to, you get labeled as far right, and so
Right.
people get
That
pushed
men's
right.
right activist, yeah, all this
Yeah,
weirdness that has grown out of it.
yeah.
Out of
So the
things that
only
were
the only
actually
people,
legitimate issues, but then what we get are Andrew Tates of the world, the
yeah,
Jordan Petersons of the world, who have decided to create platforms and manipulate. And I think Peterson probably had good intentions from the very beginning. I think he lost his mind and his way because power corrupts and absolute
yeah,
power corrupts absolutely. And he had all this power over all these young men's lives. And you know, I yeah, I think people who seek power are the ones who should be prevented from having it.
yeah. But I don't see a way to even begin to address a lot of these problems, especially in the current paradigm. Like, okay, we want to make education better. How are we going to do that when the US government, as it is going to be in the very near future, is determined to gut the Department of Education, to politicize education, to install people who are ideologically aligned with themselves? How are you supposed to overcome that? Yeah, and that's just one aspect of all this. To even the mechanisms to improve the situation in the longer term are now out of reach, to a very large degree. Um, I've been watching a lot of videos from political commentators on YouTube, and a lot of them are saying, my subscribers have gone way down. People are just giving up on politics and stepping away after this. They feel like they can't win, that there is no path to any sort of victory. I don't think that's true, but equally, I don't see a path available to address these deep, abiding issues. You've got the ostensible left self sabotaging constantly, blaming the wrong people, doubling down, and you've got the right exploiting people who don't know any better. There's no nice way to say it, or who are so consumed by hate that their desire to hurt other people outweighs their desire to help themselves. And I'm having a real crisis of empathy and compassion at the moment.
Mhm.
I normally try to understand at least, and try and get a handle on why someone may have made a decision that I don't agree with, even if I don't agree with it. But I'm finding that really hard this time around because Trump is so egregiously, obviously awful. It is hard to understand why a majority of Americans would support such a person.
Yeah, I I also struggle with that part in a whole bunch of ways. But why do people put heroin in their veins? They know it's bad for them, you know.
Yeah.
Mean, I can't explain a lot of why people are susceptible to the grift, but as I've been explaining to people, it's called a confidence game for a reason. Confidence games, like what does that mean? That means the grift depends upon your confidence that you're smart and cannot be grifted to make it
Yeah.
work. Because now you have to buy in. Once you're in, you're in. And if you
Yeah.
say, "Oh, see, I, I'm going to just tell you, this is a gift of being autistic. I want to know when I'm wrong. I'm absolutely desperate to know when I'm wrong. When people who I respect and love and care about tell me that I've done something that hurt them or was wrong, I'm going to analyze it. I'm going to take it down to first principles and see what happened here. That that's just
Yeah.
let's put
I
it very bluntly, the vast majority of people are just not capable of doing that.
I have a similar thing, but coming from a different mental aberration. So I have really, really severe depression. And
Mhm.
so I question absolutely every decision I ever make intensely. I play it over and over in my mind. I think about every possible negative repercussion. So before anything comes out of my mouth or my fingers, I've already agonized over it a huge amount. A lot of people don't get that either. When I speak with confidence, it is because I have done that, done all that lack of confidence leading up to it. So
Yeah.
it's interesting to hear your perspective on that from the other way.
Well, so well, and let me tell you that the autism diagnosis is recent. I spent the majority of my 20s and 30s in deep depression. In, just the only thing I could do was go out and go to work and come home. And um, fortunately, this is, by the time it was at its worst was around 98. And so, I was able to get online and begin to connect with people again. But I was still very, very isolated. And so one of the things I learned, and my depression started years before, when I was in junior high, at least, maybe a little earlier, that by the time I got through it, or as I was going through it, I realized that in a bizarre way, my depression was a gift and that at some point everybody should go through it because it changed how I thought about the world. It changed how I thought about myself. It made me, I was already a fairly introspective person, but it made me a seriously deep thinker. It really improved my ability to parse out, did this behavior of mine actually cause this result in
Yeah,
someone else or whatever? And it really helped me to focus on what's really important, and I'll be honest, as a, you know, big string of letters, ADHD, ASD, blah, 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 and PTSD veteran in my 50s, disabled. I have the highest risk for suicide of pretty much anybody in the world.
yeah,
And what I experienced is what allows me to tell people, no, you don't need to worry about that. That I went through it. I had the times and the opportunities, and I did the thinking of, is it really worth? Do I really need to continue? Why should I experience this? And honestly, in the end, it was, well, because as far as I know at this point, it's the only chance I get to do anything. So let's
yeah,
keep doing stuff. Even
yeah.
if all
Similar.
I'm doing is reading a book,
It's still
I'm
something.
I'm doing
Yeah,
stuff.
yeah, yeah. It's a privilege merely to exist, that we should all grasp, I think. A lot of people are going to be feeling well, depressed isn't the right word. Sad, I suppose. Um, Grief stricken, I think, is the closest thing by what's happened. Do you think there's
Yeah.
any points of light in all this? Another thing that confounded me about this election was that so many of the sort of single measures passed. Like, how do you vote for Trump and vote to raise the minimum wage? How do you vote for Trump and vote at the state level for abortion rights to be secured? That doesn't
Or secure
make
gender identity in a state constitution. I mean,
yeah.
there's all kinds of.
How how does that make sense? It doesn't to me. So
So it,
those are signs that there's some good out there still. Of course, the problem is that's all state level, not federal. But do you, and this is likely to create a lot of community organizations and all of that. But you know, charity is a failure of governance. It's a saying
mm,
from a German comedian over here. You know, if or I think he said philanthropy, but it applies
yeah.
to charity as well. But do you see any points of light in all this?
So I do actually. So starting in 2019, I became active in New York City, New York State politics at the Democratic Party level. And, I did what I do as a crisis chef manager and as a dungeon master. I read the rules, right? At So it started with Kings County, which is Brooklyn, New York. And so I'm just going to take you through the litany of failures and how to correct them at the end. So in 2019, it turns out the smallest political machine piece in New York City politics is called the political club. The political club, the oldest one, there's a Thomas Jefferson here in Brooklyn that's been here forever. There's, all these different clubs, and they're usually neighborhood, area, or person related. And a lot of electeds will start a club, and then when they're no longer in office, it'll go away and a new. So I was at like the ground floor of our U.S. representatives trying to start one for Bushwick. And very, very early on, like it was, all right, well, what should we focus on? And I was immediately, census. Like, what? Why? I go, look, man, it's all about the numbers. The game is how many people live in your state, in your county, in your district. So we know that these numbers aren't right. So we need to focus on that. And as a political club, which means we're the ones in the neighborhood, we should be the best people to get the neighborhood counted. Oh, no, 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 no. That's not what Democratic Party does. That's not what we do. That's the census. So I was stunned. I just was absolutely flabbergasted that either they were willfully ignorant or there was total lack of understanding of the importance. So then I found a political club that was not associated. It was free formed, very much part of this progressive movement in North Brooklyn. And I got involved with analyzing the rules, coming up with suggestions for fixing the rules. And of course, 2020, 21, 2022 happens. By 2022 in New York State, we lose control of the House. Why? Because of New York State. And everybody would say, oh, you lost four House because of these four specific races, one of which was George Santos. And I'm like, no, no, don't forget about the contested one that was up in the mid Hudson. Okay. And don't forget about the fact that we lost one seat in the House of Representatives because we were 89 people short on the census. And I tell
Mhm.
people, I guarantee within a 4-block radius of my apartment, there were over 100 people who were uncounted. Guarantee it. Absolutely. So this is when things really became Limburger. I was like, man, this does not smell good at all. And then the state rules. So after 2022, there was this movement to address the Democratic Party chair and have him replaced. So I got involved with them. I analyzed their rules. In fact, their rules were horrible. They're totally fucked up. They're just absolutely terrible. And it turns out Kings counties were actually really good. They just weren't being enforced.
Mhm.
Yeah, well, in Kings County, that chairperson at the Kings County, their title is literally party boss. So right, yeah, right out of old machine politics. It never went away in Brooklyn. Um, so I'm working with a bunch of people. I'm getting very involved with my assembly member, which is our House of Representatives in New York. And I came up with the solution. And you've heard me say it, my political mantra: integrity, transparency, accountability. When you create a system based on transparency and accountability, it self-selects for people with integrity, because people with integrity don't mind being held accountable.
Yeah, yeah.
And then I started diving into what's going on with the cannabis issue here in New York. So we legalized cannabis. It got out of control because it was now legal to consume and possess in 2021, and they didn't have anything rolled out. And all of a sudden there were illegal pot shops, and I got on to the community board for my area, which is a part of New York state government.
Mm.
It is part of, the tripartite there is New York City mayor, borough president, community boards, right? And our power is supposed to be the power of investigation, the power to say, give us information.
Mm.
So I'm like, well, why can't we get the information? Why are complaints not being documented? Why do I have people? Because I ended up on the committee that approves liquor and cannabis licensing. And as a chef, if I'm going to open a restaurant, I need to have a game plan. I need to have a business plan. I need to be able to show my P&L. I need to be able to show my menu mix. How much of this am I selling? How much more food? How much food do I have to sell so that I'm not dependent on alcohol sales? And then alcohol sales just become a bonus, right? All these types of things. This is how
Yeah,
I do
yeah,
stuff. And when I try to introduce this into being a professional at the CB level, they rejected it. It was too much work. So then I went through, because they had to start to approve cannabis license without any guidance from the state. So I pulled out there. I did what I did with them, with the county rules and the state rules, and I wrote up a report, and I said, okay, this is what the law tells us as a community board, everything that we're supposed to do. I made a nice document. And I was told, no, we're not going to do that. It's too much. It's too much to ask. Who asked to who? The people who are asking us for the opportunity to sell pot in our community? No, because then you find yourself giving it to people who are terrible business people,
yeah,
who
yeah,
might be a nice guy, but they're not good business people as compared to somebody who isn't. So, anyway, the whole structure. So, it turns out I'm on a call with all these electeds and with all of these various heads of agencies, and everybody's screaming at the agency people, telling them about all the problems, and not one of those agencies has the mandate to address those problems. And I kept saying, okay, where's Department of Sanitation? Where's the sheriff's department? Because that's what the law said, is that all
yeah,
enforcement went to the sheriff's department. So what happens is that, unfortunately, it got covered up because at the same time that all these people got nailed in the mayor's office, people close to him have had all kinds of, I don't know, you probably don't follow New York City politics, but his administration's blowing up. There's all kinds of stuff going on, all kinds of people leaving. And at the same time, the sheriff gets arrested because he was taking bribes from illegal pot shops to keep them open, and he was getting a
Yeah,
cut.
yeah,
And I solved it. Why? Because I read the fucking rules. And when I pointed it out to the electeds that the problem was a poorly written law, I've been cut out.
mm.
I am no longer part of that community. I'll
So
have to do it a different way.
yeah, so there's no stomach to do the work. People just get involved, what, to virtue signal,
Correct.
to demonstrate
Pat
their
themselves,
allegiance.
mhm, pat themselves on the back to make themselves look important. Some people, it is the beginning of the path to higher office. Um, so when I came out with my mantra, I said, this is the answer. The answer is you have to professionalize the party. Everybody who, because that's the deal, is that the Democratic Party, what is that? What part of government is that? Do you
Yeah,
know? It's
well,
zero. It is
yeah,
zero part of government. It is a club. It is an organization. It's a club that creates its own rules. So this is one of the things that got people pissed off, I think, when they started leaning into Kamala was never received a vote for by anybody to run for president, that she was fiat. Well, just so you know, yeah, that's the rules. They followed the rules. The rules all say they can do these things. You don't
yeah.
know the rules because you never played the fucking game. So what I came up with is just as my, and this is how I got to where I am with gaming. Okay. We professionalize and certify dungeon masters. We professionalize and certify the basic levels of working for the Democratic Party. The state of
Mm.
Michigan did this, and they were able to. Now, I haven't really looked at the numbers because I'm not even interested in looking at the numbers for a while yet. But in previous elections, they've been able to get a Democratic Party presence in every county in the state. And when I show my plan to people up and down, they all agree. Not one of them will step up. Not one of them has said, oh, well, let me hire you to make this happen. Let me talk to you about how to create legislation to make this happen. Like, no,
Mm. No,
they're
no interest.
so that's why I'm starting with role playing
Start,
games.
yeah, start small and work your way up. So, I mean, that's always the way, isn't it? The right, despite their disagreements, somehow manage to come together. The left always, well, ostensible left in the States. I
Mm-hmm.
hate calling them left wing
Yeah,
because they're
I
not.
know. Just call them Democrats.
So
Just call them.
it's a bugbear of mine. Um,
Yeah.
but they're always, yeah, it's never good enough for some aspects of that broad coalition. Um, and so, you end up divided and divided and divided and unable to come together. And people will pick a single issue and they will decide everything on that single issue, even though in a two-party system, which you have, that's your choices. You're going to have to take some rough with the smooth.
Yeah.
So do you think that's kind of moral puritanism is another problem?
Oh, hell yeah. Well, I mean the orthodoxy of belief that we have an epistemological crisis across the world, but it's really centered
Yeah.
here in the U.S. Um, what I can tell you is that um, since we first met, I've been focused on getting back into the gaming community and understanding what happened. And so I went to all the gaming conventions this summer, Origins, Gen Con, and then I was at New York Comic Con. And I would talk very briefly, pretty much every table about integrity, transparency, accountability. My political mantra, just at some point, it would be appropriate to kind of pop this in. Everybody agrees with me. All of these Midwest blue collar working class guys who sit around the gaming table, they go, yep, I hear what you're saying. Absolutely. I can get behind that.
Mm.
And really that's what it comes down to, is lack of professionalism, lack of ethical guidelines, and lack of integrity. People, to
Yeah.
me, so truth means your words are true, and integrity means your actions follow your words.
Yeah, I've seen this whole thing unfold before in microcosm, um, in gaming and from gaming onward, outward into the media. And I think it's the same problem with politics. So we've had a media that has agenda pushed over reality. They've willingly sacrificed their own audience, attacked their own audience. They've lost all credibility because they've been taking bribes or helping friends who, boost their careers or whatever. And all of that stuff piles up. And then getting that integrity back takes 10 times the work as losing it does. And you have to be completely consistent. And the only way back from that brink is to be authentic, be transparent, be accountable to your audience. But you have to do it for 10 times as long to get your reputation back. And I see the same thing happening in politics. And equally, you know, as we lost faith in the media, a whole bunch of alternative voices began to pop up. A lot of people ended up, you sort of turned on to them, but they've turned out to be just as corrupt, a lot of them, in their own way and for much smaller amounts of money or just for clicks. They'll gin up a story from nothing. So we end up at an even worse position than we were to start with, where we can't trust independent media and we can't trust conventional media. Yeah, everyone's grifting one way or another. And so it feels the same in politics. We've lost so much faith in conventional politics that fringe figures come to the fore, but they're even worse. It's just they're different.
Well, there is in America a fascination with the new shiny that is, kind of a dichotomy to the Make America Great Again. So, yeah, it's definitely a confusing state. I think one of the biggest issues is what you've said, this loss of trust, this loss of so what I've been saying is we no longer have a Walter Cronkite. We used to have one voice that we knew was telling us the way it was. And now we live in a world of thousands of cults.
Mm,
Not They're not dependent upon reality, they're self-reinforcing. And so what I'm hoping to do, this so shining lights, create a system of certification based upon integrity, transparency, and accountability, starting with games. Let people understand that living a life with integrity really means living a life without guilt,
oh,
right? A long time ago, I made a decision that this was the defining term for me because I I was I, I was really good at spinning a grift. What I wasn't good at is living with the guilt.
mm,
And when then it became, well, if your grift is based on lies, Now you have to build and create a self-consistent lie that must be reinforced. And it just, the whole, again, second, third, fourth order thinking,
Yeah, yeah,
Now I kind of followed it out to its logical conclusion when I was in junior high. And I went, oh, yeah, no, I don't want to be that person.
yeah, yeah.
Some
And
people now see that the way to get ahead is to lie, grift, cheat, steal, murder, rape, assault, whatever you can do, and just
yeah,
deny it. And as long as you deny it, that's all that matters.
right. And the checks and balances that are supposed to keep all of this in order. I mean, rules and regulations, checks and balances. These are an artificial conscience for people who don't have one,
Mm-hmm.
essentially.
Correct.
Um, but when all of those structures are corrupted by the people who are willing to lie and cheat and steal, what mechanisms are left? I think that's the problem we face now.
Revolution. Revolution.
Well,
I mean,
nobody
right.
really.
That's but who has the balls to actually make it happen?
Yeah.
That's there you go. I mean,
Uh,
if it
uh,
had gone, yeah, if it had gone the other way, I don't think that we would have seen um armed rebellion in the street. I think most people are too risk adverse um, to actually take up arms against the government. I think that what we need is another women's suffrage. We need that experience in this country again.
hmm,
Because so over the last few years, with the political work I've done, I've been doing a bunch of certification and stuff because I'm just trying to stay busy. I took this course on how to be a human rights educator. That was really interesting because that was also a weird grift. But I came out of it with the understanding that in reality, there are no God given natural rights. There's only one right, and that's the right to an opinion, and you don't even have the right to express it. The only way you have the right to express it is by organizing and protecting yourself to express that opinion. And in the United States, we call that a franchise. And
yeah,
that is the only right you have. Everything else is built upon and dependent upon those rights. So again, it comes back to civics. People don't understand that. They believe that they have all of these natural rights, these God given rights. I'm going to tell you, as someone who is in the military, no. You join the military, you're no longer covered by the Constitution.
yeah,
All of a sudden, all those things that you think are rights are gone. And the other thing I learned from this is that so in the military, in the Navy in particular, they talk about rights and responsibilities. And as you go up in rank, you increase your corresponding responsibilities. And
right.
so if
That
you look
used
at
that used to be the rule for everybody. That was everyone's understanding. You have these rights, but they come with these responsibilities. But that's not how
right,
people look at it anymore.
correct, correct, exactly. So in the United States, we have more rights than any other citizen in the world. Therefore, we should have the corresponding responsibilities, but we don't. We don't engage. We don't participate in democracy. We have allowed ourselves to be convinced by Madison, uh, where the marketing that that's not what makes you a good American. What makes you a good American is how much shit you own.
Yeah. And that's not just America that's affected by that. I think other countries have a different character, but the American way of life seems to kind of spread like a fungus,
Mm-hmm.
hitting the other Anglo countries first, but it continues to spread. I certainly see a lot more of that kind of selfish individualism here in the UK more and more over my lifetime than it has been. So that brings me to kind of the final thing I want to touch on because I'm running out of time here.
Yeah.
Um, I look around the world, and the societies that I see as the most free tend to be ones with a great deal of local democracy, um, and a communitarian approach. What provides the greatest freedom for the greatest number of people, and what safeguards those freedoms. So that tends to lead me to look at the Scandinavian countries as a model for how the rest of the world ideally should be organized. But when I've discussed this, quite commonly something comes back to me that Americans just don't behave like that and don't think like that, and they probably never will. And I see that same attitude more and more expressed here in the UK. This loss of community, this idea that I'm out to get as much as I can from whatever system exists, and damn everybody else. I would much rather hurt someone else than help myself and my own group. The main example for this that I take over here, and obviously one that's of interest to me as someone who's disabled, I look at disability payments, right?
Hmm.
And there is such a massive hate towards anyone getting handouts or what they perceive as handouts, and a massively overproportionate concern that some people might be cheating the system, when in reality, it costs more to police the system than is lost through fraud. Most people aren't fraudulent. Um, uh, but I've got people telling me that in the States, these programs, such as they are, there's a lot more fraud than we see in other countries because of this lack of communitarian thinking, this focus on, I'll get mine and damn everybody else. I see that often enough as a counter argument that I started to give it some credibility. Um, Now you interact with these systems more directly as a veteran, someone disabled. Do you think there's any truth to that? Is American culture just not keyed to this kind of communitarian thinking? A rising tide lifts all boats. Is it always out for yourself?
Um, it's parochial, right? I mean,
Mm.
like of the parish, like of a small area, right? Um, I think Americans are more parochial than they are cosmopolitan. So there's always been a huge, I mean, you guys have the childhood story of City Mouse and Country Mouse?
I've heard of it, but I've not seen it. So,
Yeah, so that's a big story we grew up with. So there's a big dichotomy between um rural and urban life. And like dramatically different, just very, very different worlds. Um, in I would say no, that Americans are actually very community minded. They join clubs, they join um, civic organizations, they participate in the home grange, they go to potlucks. Um, do we still have the Boob Schultzes where you can go to the guy and say, hey man, I'll help you with farm labor if you help me with farm labor? I don't know. I'm not there. I'm not out in the country on a daily basis. But um depending on where I am in rural America. So oddly, I find rural Kentucky to not be very community minded. I find rural Michigan to be very community minded. Um, but this, what we're doing right now, you know, 2012, they show the statistics over and over again. All of a sudden, more Americans were online than weren't, and the mental health crisis among young girls skyrocketed immediately, and it's just been going up ever since.
mm.
Young boys, it's been a different direction. Now we have incels, right? I think those are the two things are the same for boys and girls. Girls who are manipulated into self-harm through food, exercise, cutting, whatever. And boys are influenced into self-harm by becoming pariahs and misogynists.
Yeah.
So,
Well, I mean,
but
in very broad psychological terms, that is quite a big difference between the sexes. Women tend to internalize all this negativity, and men tend to externalize all their negativity and lash out. So that's not
right,
that surprising, but it can be the manifestation of exactly the same thing in two
right.
different ways.
Correct, correct. And so that's part of the issue, when we get down to the whys. What are the first principles? Well, the first principle is, where did this start? You know, because when I go in and I see a problem and I go, well, why is it this way? And if someone says, well, it's always been this way, uh-oh. Well, now I need to look and see, why is it that way?
Mm.
Um, the beginning of this search, and that led, because this is, the medium itself is not a problem. This is how we met, right? And we're
Yeah,
able to
yeah,
actually do what everybody had hoped for, which was engage in stimulating an intellectual conversation. And so my search started with trying to understand what was going on with social media and how it was influencing. And I came across a guy, his name is C. Tai Nguyen, and he's a philosopher out of University of Utah, and he studies philosophy of games, and among other things. And he was talking about Twitter, how when Twitter came out, we all were like, awesome, here's this opportunity to do what we're doing, engage in intellectual discourse and a free exchange of ideas. And one day, and all his Twitter companions were other philosophers. So that's pretty much what they did. And then one day, he tweeted something before he left for work about something his 3-year-old son had done that was very funny. And he returned 5 hours later to discover it had, thousands of likes and hundreds of retweets. And he found himself spending the next month trying to recreate that.
mm,
So, why? What happened? The game of Twitter is actually likes and retweets. And you get likes and retweets by distilling your thoughts to the lowest common denominator that can be said in the fastest, coarsest, or most entertaining way, instead of the most intellectually stimulating way.
mm,
And that people have begun to think of games, as in particular role-playing games, I discovered, as just a way of self-expression, so that they can never lose. They can never experience loss. They can never have hardship. And what Nguyen says is that his definition of a game is artificial barriers to success. So the game of basketball isn't just throw it a ball through a hoop to score points. You have to dribble. That's an artificial barrier. Okay, voting, we had that again, democracy is a game. We have barriers to participation. You have to go and physically register yourself, or now you can do it online when you turn 18 instead of auto. It just happens. They know they have all the information there. All we do is go and confirm it, and then they flick a switch.
yeah,
Okay. And then you have, so every barrier to participation. So now what happens is when there's too many rules, what happens? Right? We lose players. We know that simulationist games with lots and lots of detailed rules only appeal to a real small select. So who's going to go through all the hoops and jumps to vote? These
yeah,
are the big pictures that we're not thinking about. And these are the big pictures that I think, starting with certification, professionalization of just game masters, game coordinators, and players, this combination, create a guild of like-minded people who understand integrity, transparency, and accountability is important. And the rules mean
yeah.
something.
So with the problem with the internet
Hmm.
I think when it started, I was an fairly early adopter. I used to dial into BBSs and things way back in the day. Got online as what we recognize as
Hmm.
the web now about 95, but I'd been already tinkering beforehand. That was fine. Websites and forums, that was largely fine. Some forums had overzealous moderators. You just go to a different forum. Social media when it first came in, like MySpace, tribes, things like that, they were fine as well. It's as the monetization came in and it became yeah, about this sort of inorganic popularity where you're deliberately fishing for it or you're paying to have your tweets promoted, or where the timelines stopped being chronological in order and they became which ones have been interacted with the most. And you get this positive feedback loop of, something negative gets more attention, more interaction, and therefore gets even more exposure. And, positive feedback loops are bad in engineering
Hmm.
or computing, or they spin out of control naturally, and that's what we're seeing. But there isn't a way back because the motivation isn't the gamification. The game of it is not to build communities and to communicate with one another. It is to make money
Right. And
from
that's why I want to
advertising.
change the game. That's why the
Yeah.
game has to change. So, what I saw between my exit in 2010 and my reappearance over the last 2 years into the community is, there used to be an easy dozen, like, major sites to go and get gaming news and interaction and threads and forums, etc. What is there now besides N World? Is RPG Net still a thing?
It's still a
No.
thing, but it's pointless going there largely.
Right. So my point is that if there were still a dozen interesting places to have these conversations and not just those two, what would your career be like right now?
Probably better because
Correct.
there
That's
would
my
be,
point.
yeah, there'll be
Okay.
bigger
So
cross sections of
that's
people in the same place. So it's, yeah.
right. So now we have, what do we do? I mean, I've met Russ briefly years and years ago. I know lots of people who know him. He seems very competent at what he does, but again, with great power comes great responsibility, and um, I don't think it's
Power
been
corrupts.
it, and power corrupts. And so he's not the most corrupt, but I think that he has a system that has been very successful for him. And the paradigm has worked. And so, therefore, in his mind, the paradigm is good. It's been
Yeah.
good for him instead of looking at what does the system do overall? How does this system make a better community? And if the answer is it eliminates the unwanted, again, we're supposed to be this embracing open community for gamers. We're
Mm.
supposed to be the liminal of the liminal, so we accept everybody. And now
Yeah.
we have a system involved to create good fun, bad fun.
Yeah. And to eliminate the bad fun people
Right.
from wherever you are. But there is a problem I don't think you can necessarily overcome with that, in that people select themselves out. They decide they want to be in a bubble. They decide they want to
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
exclude.
Well, that's the tweets, that's the likes and retweet problem.
Yeah.
That's right there is what happens. So what happens is how does someone go from being um, considered left wing to now being considered a MAGA supporter? What happens is people get attacked and isolated from their original community. And then the whatever weird single issue reason that is, the right they love bomb you.
Yeah.
It's just they oh no, you're awesome, you're cool, and of course they
Yeah.
feel good about this and they feel accepted. So you're gonna all of a sudden you're gonna want to continue to do and say things that make you feel good, that make people
Yeah.
around you treat you well. It's just it's human nature. I mean, it's not. This isn't this isn't fucking rocket science, man. This is not putting people on the moon. This is what we've done since the beginning. We've always done
Yeah.
this. What human
It's
beings
dealing
do.
with it and creating the cultural tools to work within the problems that it creates. That's the trick.
Well, the tool has outstripped our ability to function with it. We don't have the cognitive ability. So, all right, my friend, it's wonderful as always talking with you. And
Anytime.
I look forward to many more years of great discussions. All right.